The Battle of the Wabash, also known as the Battle of 1,000 Slain or St. Clair's Defeat, took place on November 4, 1791 in the Northwest Territory, which is now part of Ohio. During this battle, U.S. forces clashed with the Western Confederacy of Native American tribes as part of the Northwest Indian War, and the result was the most devastating loss in the history of the United States military when facing Native forces. Although many Americans are familiar with names such as Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, General George Armstrong Custer, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, few understand that the most brutal and catastrophic defeat inflicted by Native Americans took place 85 years prior. Despite causing more deaths, exhibiting greater violence, and having more significant lasting impacts than the Battle of Little Bighorn, St. Clair's defeat remains a remarkably obscure event in early American history. Following the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially ended the American Revolutionary War, Great Britain acknowledged the United States' control over the land stretching east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. However, the treaty discussions did not include Native American tribes in the Old Northwest. As a result, many of them rejected U.S. claims to the lands northwest of the Ohio River, particularly well-known leaders like Shawnee War Chief Blue Jacket and Miami Chief Little Turtle. At the time, the newly formed United States was struggling with massive debt from the Revolutionary War and had limited power to collect taxes under the Articles of Confederation. To raise revenue, the government devised a plan to sell land in the Northwest Territory, which meant displacing both Native communities and unauthorized settlers already living in the area. Throughout the mid to late 1780s, violent confrontations between Native tribes and American settlers intensified, and Native resistance threatened to halt expansion into this contested region. In response to the growing unrest, Judge John Cleves Symmes and Jonathan Dayton urged President George Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox to authorize military action against the Miami Nation, seeking to break their resistance and open the land for American settlement. In 1790, just 2 years after the U.S. Constitution was ratified, the young nation faced a serious test of its authority in the Old Northwest Territory, an area that included what is now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. Native American tribes in the region began launching attacks on American settlers. British forces that continued to occupy a number of military installations in defiance of the conditions of the peace that had formally ended the American Revolutionary War, as well as British operatives operating out of Canada, frequently backed and encouraged these incursions. In response to increasing raids by the Miami under Chief Little Turtle, President George Washington ordered an expedition led by Brigadier General Josiah Harmar to put a stop to the attacks. Josiah Harmar commanded a force of 1,453 men on October 7, 1790, which included 1,133 militia and 320 regulars from the 1st American Regiment. In order to fight American expansion north of the Ohio River, the force marched north from Fort Washington, which is now Cincinnati, Ohio, toward Kekionga, a major Miami settlement and the site of Fort Miami. From October 19th to October 22nd, several of Harmar's detachments were sent into hostile territory and ambushed by Native warriors defending their homeland. Despite repeated attacks, Harmar failed to reinforce his troops and eventually ordered a retreat back to Fort Washington, having lost over 200 men and a third of his pack horses. Between 120 and 150 Native people were thought to have died and been injured. Poor planning, lack of supplies, and underestimating Native tactics led to a decisive defeat for Harmar. Following this failure, the U.S. organized a larger and better prepared expedition to confront the now emboldened Miami Confederacy. The task fell to Major General Arthur St. Clair, governor of the Northwest Territory and a veteran of the Continental Army, who was instructed to launch a stronger military campaign by the summer of 1791. The 1st American Regiment, a 2nd Infantry Regiment, approximately 800 volunteers who were recruited for 6 months and divided into 2 levy regiments, Kentucky militia, and a few cavalry units made up the force that was gathered for the operation. Altogether, the Army totaled roughly 1,400 troops. Although President George Washington had firmly directed General Arthur St. Clair to launch the expedition during the summer, a series of logistical setbacks and supply delays significantly hampered the pace of preparations. Meanwhile, in May 1791, Lieutenant Colonel James Wilkinson was assigned to launch a raid later that August. The goal was to create a diversion that would support General St. Clair's advance northward. During what became known as the Battle of Kennepocamakwa, Wilkinson's forces killed 9 members of the Wea and Miami tribes and captured 34 Miami prisoners, one of whom was the daughter of Miami war leader Little Turtle. At the time, several leaders within the Native Confederation were considering peace negotiations with the United States. However, once word of Wilkinson's raid spread, those talks fell apart. Rather than weakening their resolve, the raid galvanized the tribes, rallying them to prepare for all-out war. Not long after, St. Clair would suffer one of the most disastrous defeats in U.S. military history. Major General Arthur St. Clair, who was suffering from illness and, according to some, not fit to lead the mission, began his march from Fort Washington in September 1791. His force faced serious challenges from the start. Many of the troops were untrained and lacked discipline, food supplies were poor, and the Army's horses were both few and in bad condition. St. Clair commanded the building of several forts along the expedition's path as it passed through dangerous country. While this was a defensive measure, it greatly slowed their progress. By November, the Army had advanced only about 90 miles from its original starting point. The majority of St. Clair's soldiers were militia and short-term volunteers, many of whom began deserting soon after the campaign started. The troops faced freezing weather, supply shortages, and low morale. And by the time they reached the Wabash River, they were physically exhausted and deeply discouraged. To make matters worse, St. Clair sent the 1st American Regiment away from the main force to search for a delayed supply convoy, further weakening his already struggling army. General St. Clair's forces camped on a high clearing along the upper Wabash River on November 3rd, not far from the present-day location of Fort Recovery, Ohio. Crucially, in the event of an attack, it would be challenging to coordinate defense since the Kentucky militia was positioned on one bank of the river and the 1st Infantry and volunteer forces were on the other. Despite sightings of native warriors in the nearby woods, no defensive fortifications were built. Major General Richard Butler, who commanded the levy regiments, sent out a small unit under Captain Jacob Slough to pursue some native scouts who had been harassing the camp. After firing on a small group, the detachment soon realized they were vastly outnumbered and rejoined the main army. After informing Butler, they cautioned that combat would probably commence at daybreak. Despite these warnings, General Butler failed to implement defensive measures for the encampment and omitted alerting General St. Clair, who had retired for the night. At that time, St. Clair's army consisted of 52 officers and 868 enlisted men and militiamen who were fit for duty. That night, a force of roughly 1,000 native warriors, under the leadership of Miami War Chief Little Turtle, moved into position, forming a broad semicircle around the unsuspecting American encampment. At dawn on November 4, 1791, a coordinated attack began. The assault was spearheaded by Little Turtle, Chief Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, and Delaware Chief Bucongahullas, with allied warriors from various nations joining them, including Potawatomi fighters from eastern Michigan who traversed the Wabash River to participate in the attack. Egushawa commanded allied groups of Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, while Simon Girty, a well-known frontiersman allied with native forces, helped lead Wyandot, Mingo, and Cherokee warriors positioned on the right flank. In an ironic twist, Adjutant General Winthrop Sargent had just criticized the militia for neglecting their scouting duties. Moments later, the native coalition launched a sudden and overwhelming attack, catching the Americans off guard and quickly pushing into the heart of their lines. As the native forces charged the main American line, the militia broke ranks and fled across the Wabash River, scrambling uphill toward the main encampment, many of them dropping their weapons in panic. In contrast, the regular troops quickly broke open their stacked muskets, formed defensive lines, and stood their ground using musket fire and bayonets. General Arthur St. Clair, who led from the front, had 2 horses shot out from under him during the chaos. He narrowly escaped death. His uniform was pierced by bullets, and a lock of his hair was shot away. Though the American artillery opened fire, the cannons were largely ineffective, as their shots flew too high to do real damage. Meanwhile, the left and right flanks of the native formation swept around and closed in, converging behind the American camp. In less than half an hour, St. Clair's entire force was surrounded. The U.S. weapons proved unreliable, and the musket and artillery fire did little to dislodge the warriors hidden behind trees and brush. As the native forces closed in, the artillery crews were forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Most of the gunners were killed at their posts. Even the women traveling with the army fought to defend themselves. Many of them were also killed in the melee. The levy soldiers' leader, Major General Richard Butler, was shot twice during the conflict and perished in his tent. In the Indian Wars, he would be the first of 4 American generals to die. After nearly 3 hours of intense combat, General St. Clair gave the order to retreat toward Fort Jefferson. Colonel William Dark led a determined bayonet charge that broke through enemy lines, clearing a path for those who could still flee. Private Stephen Little became lost in the wilderness and unintentionally made his way back to the deserted camp because of the disarray. He later recounted that the native forces had already left, chasing down the retreating soldiers. The wounded men he encountered begged him to end their suffering before the warriors returned. As the native fighters pursued the American column, they killed many of the stragglers who couldn't keep up. After chasing the retreat for several miles, the warriors returned to the battlefield to plunder the camp. Littell, hiding beneath a tree, observed them as they ate the leftover rations, divided captured supplies, and carried out horrific acts against the wounded, scalping, torturing, and killing those who remained, including women and children. The leading survivors of the retreat arrived at Fort Jefferson later that evening, having covered almost 30 miles in a single day. With limited shelter and virtually no food available at the fort, it was decided that anyone still able to travel would continue on to Fort Hamilton, about 45 miles farther. The wounded, however, were left behind at Fort Jefferson, with little to no provisions. Those on horseback reached Fort Hamilton the next morning, followed later by the exhausted men who had made the journey on foot. On November 11th, St. Clair dispatched a supply convoy from Fort Washington, along with around 100 troops under Major David Ziegler. When they arrived at Fort Jefferson, they discovered 116 survivors living off horse meat and raw hides. Charles Scott made an attempt to raise a relief force for the Kentucky militia at about the same time, but it was abandoned at Fort Washington later that month without any results. In January 1792, Lieutenant Colonel James Wilkinson made a second supply voyage to Fort Jefferson after assuming command of the 2nd Regiment. Over 600 bodies were still at the battlefield, and at least 78 more were discovered along the way. His soldiers tried to collect abandoned artillery and bury the dead, but the task was too big for them. The total number of wounded remains uncertain, but some reports suggest that fires used to execute prisoners or burn bodies smoldered for days after the battle. Out of a force of 1,400 regulars, levies, and militia, 918 were killed and 276 were wounded in the horrific conflict. This catastrophe eliminated nearly half the U.S. Army's total strength. The unprecedented 97% casualty rate among soldiers included 632 fatalities from 920 troops, with another 264 wounded. Officer losses were equally catastrophic, with an 88% casualty rate, 39 killed and 7 injured out of 52 engaged. Almost all 200 camp followers perished, bringing the total American deaths to 832. Given the military's limited size during this period, approximately 1/4 of America's entire army was annihilated in a single day. Following the disaster, St. Clair reported to Secretary of War Henry Knox and President George Washington, with the latter insisting on St. Clair's resignation. The defeat stunned Congress, prompting an official inquiry. Knox concluded that insufficient disciplined soldiers and poor seasonal timing contributed to the failure. The subsequent House investigation determined that inadequate troop numbers, severe quartermaster and contractor mismanagement, and the soldiers' lack of discipline and experience were responsible for the catastrophe. Remarkably, St. Clair escaped blame and retained his Northwest Territory governorship until 1802. Major General Mad Anthony Wayne was appointed Supreme Commander of the Army, and the Legion of the United States was established after Congress approved military expansion in early 1792. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which took place on August 20th, 1794, close to present-day Maumee, Ohio, Wayne triumphed where St. Clair had failed, soundly defeating Native American forces in less than 90 minutes. This victory concluded the Miami Campaign and established an enduring legacy of U.S. Army triumph. The newly formed Legion introduced unprecedented military professionalism and excellence that would become foundational to the regular Army. The battle's carnage was so extensive that when 300 Legion soldiers returned to the site in late 1793, they immediately identified it by the numerous unburied human remains. These troops had to clear bones merely to establish sleeping areas and subsequently created a mass grave. The aftermath continued for generations. As late as September 1851, 60 years after the conflict, the local community organized Bone Bearing Day to properly inter newly discovered remains.